If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. As we're thinking about doing busy right, we need to spend some time keeping up with current trends. I won't promise that I'll try and keep up with all of the new tools, but there are some things that get over my horizon of importance. And so I'll bring those to us and we'll talk about them and deal with them. And this episode is an example of a time when we're going to do that. I had noticed the cultural idea of monk mode out there circulating around for a little while and got sort of a request for an opinion on it. Monk mode, as I understand it, is something that we enter into specifically from time to time. The notion appears to be that when we enter into monk mode, we shut everything down. Everything has to be quiet. We lock the door, we turn everything off, and then we get into monk mode. The question is this something that I think is useful for productivity? My answer is a resounding yes. There's lots of forces that we have to deal with that interfere with our ability to do knowledge work. And since most of us are knowledge workers, and since most organizational cultures don't orient themselves towards supporting knowledge work, I think every chance we have to engage in knowledge work ideas is a good time to engage in knowledge work ideas. I like where people are going with monk mode. And I think it's great that the term's being popularized and more people are becoming aware of it. I will say that it's a new term for what is now an old idea. It's still a good idea. And every once in a while, you need to repopularize good ideas. But the idea behind monk mode has been utilized before. 15 years ago, I became aware of the term Pomodoro technique, which is you set a timer and you work until the bell goes off on the timer. It's named the Pomodoro technique because the original guy that wrote it up used a tomato kitchen timer, a tomato-shaped kitchen timer to do it. And he would set his Pomodoros for 25 minutes, and then you take a 5-minute break, and then you come do another Pomodoro. And there were a handful of rules around how to do the Pomodoro technique. And many people claimed that it was a watershed event in their own productivity at the time, but cultural trends fade, and every once in a while need to be refreshed. I'm aware of Pomodoro technique. There may be others that I wasn't as clearly aware of. And underlying these notions, Pomodoro technique, potentially others, monk mode, is this idea of work blocks. And that's my term for the same notion, is we have these times and periods when we're able to shut everything down and actually focus on our work. We're able to put the squirrels away, if you will. We're able to shut down incoming communications and interruptions and really get focused on what's going on. That means that we really understand monk mode and how to go about it. And we can build systems that support monk mode or support the Pomodoro technique or support work blocks, and that these systems will put us into this state more often and thus presumably will be more productive. And I'll talk about why that is. I'll talk about the importance of monk mode specifically with respect to knowledge workers. I'll talk about biological factors that work against monk mode, that work against these periods of fairly intense focus. I'll also talk about cultural factors that work against it. And then there are probably in your organization, there are probably some organizational factors that work against monk mode, Pomodoro technique, work blocks. So we'll talk about biological factors, cultural factors, and organizational factors. I'll also expand on the idea that I believe monk mode should be more of a default mode for us. And I'll talk about what that is why I think it's important and how we can begin to get there, as compared to monk mode being this once a week phenomenon that we have to put forth a huge amount of effort to get into. I think that if that's the idea, then that presents some of its own challenges. I think productivity, individual productivity, and thus organizational productivity would be at a higher sustainable rate if monk mode were something that we were able to easily get into multiple times per day, and if we could organize our work management processes such that monk mode was the default rather than squirrel mode. And then I'll summarize all this with some how can we work towards getting more periods of focus into our workflow on a daily basis. Monk mode as a term is actually pretty interesting for me because it's a very good term. Pomodoro technique was kind of eye-catching, but it wasn't terribly descriptive. Monk mode is, in fact, terribly descriptive of what it is that we're trying to do and of what our goal is. But it really takes us back to the history of dealing with knowledge work and maybe the evolution of knowledge work, and we can see then why we would want to get back to this. In some ways, monk mode is the way knowledge workers have worked throughout human history. So if you think about the idea of a monk is somebody that lives in a monastery. A monk doesn't have perhaps a lot to do. A monk is cloistered. Monasteries are very quiet places where sometimes it evokes the idea of a vow of silence. The monks would sometimes take a vow of silence, and I think this is a cultural thing. So using the term monk mode evokes both an idea of silence, an idea of contemplation, an idea of lack of interruptions, certainly an idea of low technology. And I think means that we recognize that our technology, one of the functions of our technology, feature or bug, is that it interrupts us a lot and distracts us a lot. So I love the term monk mode. But when we go back in the history, it's not just monks that have been engaged in knowledge work. In history, we took all of our knowledge workers and put them in special places. We took our academics and put them in universities, and people talk about, there may be a poet that talks about the sleepy spires of academia, where it's quiet and relatively boring in support of academics being knowledge workers. We have kept people that think about the law, lawyers and judges, we've kept them in courtrooms and they think about things for us. Monks think about theological matters for us. Maybe nuns fall into this same category. There have been instances of isolating our knowledge workers throughout history. To me, that means that our knowledge workers need that isolation. They need that separation. But there are many forces that fight against that separation. Now, I'll go on record and I'll say that productivity as a knowledge worker does require these periods of low, non-existent interruption. I'll also talk about distraction and what that means to a knowledge worker. But as we think about it, we go, okay, well, knowledge workers need this time in this space. The reason that's important in our current economy is because many of us are knowledge workers. Back in the day, 300 years ago, when monasteries were more of a thing, there were relatively fewer knowledge workers as a percentage of the population. Particularly since the second half of the 20th century, the percentage of knowledge work that's actually happening in our economy and in our organizations has just been steadily increasing. And so we've studied what knowledge work is and what it requires, and it certainly does require these long periods of uninterrupted, undistracted, you can use the word focused work. Monk mode really inspires this idea of shutting out the interruptions. And I define interruptions as being distinct from distractions. So interruptions are these external things that happen to us that interfere with our periods of focus. Distraction is more of an internal mental thing that interferes with our periods of focus. Interruption is actually fairly easy to deal with. You go somewhere, you go to a mountaintop where nobody knows where you are, and you can spend time uninterrupted. But uninterrupted does not mean undistracted. And distraction can be more difficult to deal with because we do it to ourselves. And so any process that considers getting into monk mode would be best supported by dealing not only with interruptions, but also with distractions. Distractions are not well understood in the way interruptions are. They're not culturally dealt with in the way interruptions are. In any work environment, you can close the door, you can put on your headphones, you can put up a flag, you can put out a message saying, hey, please don't interrupt me. And by and large, people will agree with that. Distraction has a different cause. Distraction is based on the fact that we try to use our brains in bad ways. We try to use our brains to remember things, to remind us of time-based events. We try to use our brains to remind us of tasks that have to be done when a particular context presents itself. And our brains are actually not very good at this at all. We know that when we're really in deep focus, our sense of time changes. Our sense of how time is passing changes. A lot of times people that have been in periods of extreme focus will look up and be surprised at how much time has passed because it didn't feel like their work was a struggle. And so the notion of using our brains to store context-sensitive tasks and or time-sensitive tasks is kind of a weak way to go. Maybe the worst thing about it in this context is that that's what causes these distractions. So when I say distraction, I think about things that my brain reminds me of while I'm focused on something else. And I've said this many times before, I'll be deep down in a piece of work and my brain will pop up, hey, don't forget to get the dog food. Well, I can't do anything about the dog food right now. I'm trying to get my work done. I'd appreciate it if my brain would remind me at another time. Unfortunately, that's simply not how our brains work. At least it's not how mine works. And my clients report the same thing. So I'm assuming it's fairly universal that the clock in our brain is not all that reliable. So one of the ways that we deal with this is we take tasks that once were distraction feeders and we put them into interruption feeders. And what I mean by that is if we have a task, we'll set a computer reminder and it'll ding or buzz or an alarm or whatever that is. What that means is we're trading one bad anti-focus technique for another bad anti-focus technique. It would be better if we could deal with distraction at the source, which is we need to externalize our reminders. We need to externalize our tasks into a system that will remind us specifically when we want to be reminded. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't need alarms in our world. We certainly do. And things that will snap us out of this focus. But I contend that we can build habits around focus periods of work, and we can train ourselves in such a way that we get a task, we get deep into it for 30 or 45 minutes, and then we understand when that time period ends. We understand how much work is done. So dealing with interruption and distraction is an entire process, and I'll talk a lot about that more towards the end of our episode today. So monk mode, I think, is very important, both in terms of its association with work blocks and in terms of its currency in the modern world. The fact that people are paying attention to it, the meme, if you will, is important because it draws our attention to the fact that we need a different kind of work environment from time to time. It helps us be aware of the fact that knowledge work is hampered by interruption and distraction. It helps us be aware of the fact that the forces in the world, advertising forces and economic forces, are trying very hard to put us into a state where we're more consistently distracted, where we're more consistently just viewing ads and more consistently just pulling down again to see the next chat line. And it's important for us to be aware of that because the fight that we're in here is not an easy fight. And I guess that's the sort of extreme nature of monk mode, is that people recognize that this is not just easy to slip into. And culturally speaking, we're developing habits that make it harder rather than easier. So I think all of this is very important. And monk mode is as good a term as any. It's, as I said before, it's very evocative of the state that we want to try and reach. It even gives us clues of why and how we would get into it. Against this notion, we have, I mentioned cultural factors, and we'll get to that. And there are even organizational factors that fight against these periods of focused work. But I think the first one maybe to deal with is biological factors. Our own biology, our own neurobiology in some ways fights against us. So the first of those is that our brain is this lazy operator, okay, which means, and you get hints of this in books like Thinking Fast and Slow and others that talk about how you really have to get your brain going before it'll go, that your brain loves light, easy tasks that we pick off from our to-do list. We cherry pick the stuff that's easy and knock it off the list rather than dealing with the stuff that's more challenging and complicated. And I think that's a sign that our brains are these lazy operators, is the term that I use. Biologists are very intrigued by the fact that our brain is maybe 2% of our body mass, but it consumes 20% of our calories. It consumes 20% of the energy that we take in. That means it's an expensive thing to have. And presumably, and I don't know experiments on this, I assume there are some, when we're more intensely focusing, our brain is using its energy sources more rapidly. And in a circumstance like that, biologists look and they go, well, that means that we're going to be less likely to enter into that our bodies tend towards conserving calories rather than expending them. And thus, that's the lazy operator kind of mechanism. And we see this when we, in some ways, when we think about procrastination. So I don't think of procrastination as a moral failure. I think of procrastination as a normal process that goes on in our brains, right? I think we procrastinate when we look at it, when we ask our brains to look at and engage in a task that's mushy or difficult or big or needs additional work before the brain can decide what to do about it, before we can decide what the next step is. My evidence for this is if you have a task that is small, right? Feed the dog, okay? Then you're very likely to do that. Oh, yeah, it's an interruption, but here, I'll go knock it out, no big deal. Versus a task like fix the marketing plan, and that pops up and you show it to your brain, and your brain basically, in my view, shuts down and goes, no, I'm not going to do that. There's too much thought involved. There's too much work involved. It's too much of a heavy lift. Hey, let's go look at something that's easier and I'll help you do that. And in my experience, the best way to fight procrastination is to boil that task down to the next actionable step. If you have these big indescribable tasks, these big fuzzy things that you need to do, then the best way to move on it, and this I think is well documented in the literature, the best way to move on that task is to break it down into a small actionable chunk. And then you take that action and you're more likely to continue with the task than you were just from scratch of, oh, well, review the marketing proposal. Okay, I don't even know what that means. That's this lazy operator idea, and some evidence that our brains are lazy operators and thus will fight against us as we try and get into this monk mode. We get into this this period of intense focus. Our brains really don't want to operate that way. Another thing about our neurobiology is that our brains are really attuned to novelty. They're attuned to the unexpected. In many ways, most of our senses are designed to help us detect the unexpected. And most biologists and neurobiologists think that that's to help us avoid danger. I read a book called The Experience Machine, and it's a very good book. I highly recommend it. It talks about how our brains really work with visual stimuli, for example. And the notion is that our brains predict that we will see something, and we evaluate the actual visual signal against that expectation. And we look for differences, and those differences are what draws our attention visually. The example in the book is you're walking in the forest with a friend, and your friend says, hey, look at those trees. And you turn and you look at the trees. And what stands out to you is probably not the trees themselves, but something unusual about the trees. For example, there's a brightly colored bird there. There's two squirrels chasing each other around in the trees, or one of the trees is about to fall on your head. And in language, we don't always say, hey, look at the squirrel in those trees. We say, hey, look at those trees. Something interesting is there, right? Now, maybe the trees themselves, but often it's not. And so because our brains work this way, we're hypersensitive to novelty, and distractions and new information really are novel, and our brains go, ooh, hey, what about that bright shiny? Let me inspect that bright shiny thing. And this biology, this neurobiology really works against us as we try for these longer periods of focus, because our physiology is attuned to these external interruptions. And therefore we get distracted. We get interrupted because it's external. When we're doing our work, we get these interruptions that happen. I would say a third biological factor is, and I alluded to this earlier, is our brains don't remember very well relative to timed events. So it's very easy to have an event that's supposed to happen at 3 o'clock this afternoon. And if you accidentally get focused on your work, then you don't notice that time passing unless there's an interruption, unless you've created an interruption. When we look at this, it means that we probably are using the wrong tool for the job, that we don't need to, that we shouldn't, in fact, depend on our brains to help us remember these context-sensitive or time-sensitive events. Now, it's not that it never works. If you say to yourself, hey, when I see Joe, I need to talk to her about the project, often that'll work. But it's not consistently workable, and it doesn't work very well with clock time at all. So again, our brains don't work well in these ways. And another danger of this is our brains have learned to fairly constantly remind us of things. And the example I tend to use here is if I'm at my office and my wife calls me up and says, hey, get milk on the way home, I'm happy to do that. And I say, okay, brain, remind me to get milk on the way home. Well, all afternoon, the brain's going, hey, get the milk. Did you get the milk? Don't forget the milk. Your wife will be mad if you forget the milk. It's constantly chattering away at me here. but it doesn't chatter at me at the precise moment that I need it to normally. And the precise moment that I need it to is, hey, get the milk 30 seconds before you turn right into the grocery store. So this constant chatter is something really that acts against our focus. So as we're working towards monk mode, then one of the things that will help us do that is to begin to externalize those tasks and those time-dependent things rather than trying to rely on our brains, because A, our brains are unreliable, and B, that's part of what causes that consistent chatter and distraction. We talked about biological factors. We'll talk about cultural factors against monk mode. In the modern culture, communication is very cheap. An example of this is, and there are many, but it's kind of a good story, so I'll tell it. An example of this is when I was a kid, I had cousins who were missionaries in Thailand. And there was no easy means of communicating with Thailand, at least the part of Thailand that they were in. It was such a challenge to communicate, in fact, that my cousin's family and my grandmother both bought these big reel-to-reel tape recorders. And once every 6 months or so, my cousin would sit down and record 60 or 90 minutes worth of telling us the news in their world and telling us how everybody was doing. And they'd package that tape up into a box and they'd ship it to us. And then we would all go to my grandmother's house and she would play it back for us and we'd listen to it, kind of like listening to the radio as a family. Now, if I want to have a conversation with somebody in Thailand, my biggest problem is time zone difference. There's certainly not a technological problem there. I send them an email with a link, and 30 seconds later, we're on a Zoom meeting having a conversation. What that means, since communication has gotten cheap, publication has gotten cheap, all of these ways to give information to each other have gotten terribly inexpensive. Economics will tell you that when something gets inexpensive, we get more of it. And we all see that we're getting more and more communication. We're getting more and more information. The fact that communication is so cheap means that we get a lot of it. And when we have a lot of communication, we feel the need to process a lot of communication. It's all information channels, and we feel the need to process that information. And that's a cultural factor that gets us away from these long periods of time when we can focus, because culturally, we know that we should be available to other people when they want to try to communicate with us, when they want to try and text us, when they want to try and ring our phones, when they want to try and get us on Slack or via email. And this means that part of our awareness is constantly attuned to those information channels, and thus that in itself is a distraction. Psychologists have studied the fact that if you can see your cell phone, you perform as if your IQ were somewhat lower than it actually is, and that there's a little part of your brain that's constantly aware of that and is constantly trying to alert you to the fact that the phone might ring at any moment. Cheap communication, that more information idea. And another thing that's happening, I believe, with more information is that we're losing patience about when we become aware of information. Now, I'll illustrate this with a story that you might find intriguing. Those of you that know me well know that I live in the state of Alabama in the U.S. Around this part of the world, we're very big college football fans. And just recently, we had the experience of finding out whether or not Alabama was going to be included in the football playoffs that'll happen in early January of next year. And it's a big deal around here anyway. The announcement was going to happen at 11 o'clock our time this past Sunday, as I record this past Sunday morning. Well, those of you that know me well know that I'm in church at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. And so I was real interested to see what would happen. And I knew what would happen, right? In a room with 200 people that are sitting listening to a pastor, somebody's going to have their phone out and somebody's going to know this piece of information. Well, I decided to use this as some sort of experiment. And I was trying to not be aware that this information was going to happen at 11 o'clock. I was trying to resist the temptation to look around and see if somebody had found out this information. And it was very interesting because I was watching my brain work, and what kept coming to mind for me is I'm very patient about learning this information right up until about 11 o'clock. And the knowledge that somebody else in my peer group would know this information at 11 and I wouldn't know this information at 11 really was something that irritated me a little bit. And this may just be me. But as long as nobody knew the information, I could be very patient about the time when it was going to be announced. But knowing that other people would become aware of this information when it was announced made me more alert to that information and more aware of the fact that I would feel some sense of loss if another person knew it and I didn't. If that sounds a lot like FOMO, fear of missing out, then I think we're on the same track thinking about this. And it was really interesting to see how that happens. But that's not the only evidence of FOMO. I mean, it's a cultural phenomenon. We actually have this fear that something's going to happen that we're not aware of. And that's driven because of the cheap availability of awareness of information. Somehow we feel a loss if we don't have this information, but it's a real cultural factor. Again, it goes back to making us hyper aware of our information channels. And that hyper awareness works against our ability to stay in monk mode. Our tendency is to leave our communication channels open, in part because of FOMO. We don't want to be the last one to find something out. God forbid we should not know it for some extended period of time. You know, back to the Alabama playoff example. This is not terribly actionable information for me, right? Whether Alabama's going to be in the playoffs or not in the playoffs meant that we're going to play on Monday rather than Saturday. Now, either of these games is 3 weeks away as I record this, so it's not like I have to rush to get somewhere and do something about it. But there was still this nagging sense of urgency to find this information out. So I found that intriguing, and maybe you've had an experience that's similar to that. So we've talked about biological factors against monk mode. We've talked about cultural factors against monk mode. So now we'll deal with some organizational factors against monk mode. And again, I'm reviewing all this just in support of the notion that we're going to have to work to get into monk mode. We're going to have to work that much harder to get into it more often, but I think that is a very strong goal for us as knowledge workers, is to get into these periods where we can really focus on what's going on, where we can really use our brains effectively to help us solve problems, because we all know what happens when we're solving a problem and get interrupted or distracted. So that's why I'm talking about these factors, just as a reminder for you. So these organizational factors against monk mode. In most modern organizations, there is at least an unstated expectation around how quickly you will respond to some request for your attention. Whether it be stated, we'll answer all our emails within an hour, and we'll answer chat within 15 minutes, and we'll answer our phone immediately. Whether it's stated that precisely or unstated and just part of the culture, we're all aware that our teammates and our organizations expect us to be responsive. that need for responsiveness, in particular, the need for a timed response or a time-limited response, forces us to be constantly aware of our communication channels. And that awareness, like with the phone, or is similar to fear of missing out, FOMO, that constant need to be aware of these communication channels is a drain on our focus resource. So your organization is probably a factor against your ability to enter into these longer periods of deep focus, which is the most productive for knowledge work. Another thing that your organization may do is the communication channels may proliferate in your organization. What I mean by that is most organizations have had email. In fact, some organizations are removing their email, but that's another story. Almost every organization has email, which is this instantaneous communication. And along with email comes an expectation of a fairly immediate response in many cases. But not only do we have email, we also have and have always had telephones. We also have at least one chat service. Most file storage mechanisms have an alert capability where you can be notified if something happens to a file in storage. And all these different communication channels mean that not only do we have to be aware of communication, but we have to be aware of communication from multiple sources. More subtly, it means that we don't define which information channels are important and which information channels are not. We don't hold people to these standards. In some organizations, it's true that different communication channels have different response requirements. And that's a step in the right direction from my perspective. But even then, if some of your people, say your boss, has a habit of violating those agreements, and instead of calling you to say, hey, you need to be in my office right now, there's something I need to talk to you about, they send you a text, or they put it on chat, or they send you an email, and actually hold you accountable for a high level of responsiveness to these different channels. While at the same time, other people are using, let's say, chat for trivial office chit chat. Okay, well, if you know it's trivial office chit chat, then you can shut it down for a period of time while you focus. And then when you're done focusing, you can pull it back up and catch up on the office chit chat. But if there's a possibility that your boss is using Slack to ask you to come to his or her office, that means that you've got to constantly be aware of what's going on, and that every ping and ding carries a similar level of importance because it might be the boss trying to get you to come to his or her office. So those multiple information channels and their lack of organization is another organizational factor that works against these deep periods of thought, monk mode. So we've talked about why monk mode is important. We've talked a lot about these different factors that work against it and make it difficult to get into monk mode. And that means that we believe that monk mode is some extreme effort or some extreme state of being. And I think that's not great for us, because I think it should not be some extreme, unusual thing that we do when our back is totally against the wall. But it should be something that's built into our work management system such that we're able to do 30 or 45-minute periods of focus 3, 4, even 5 times a day, depending on what the rest of our schedule is. It should be the default. But instead, and for all these reasons I've talked about before, it seems that plate spinning and squirrel catching is the default. It's interesting, plate spinning is actually putting a plate on top of a narrow steel pole and spinning it so that it stays up there. And back in the day, we had contests, about who could keep the most plates spinning at any one time. And that's a really interesting metaphor when we talk about plate spinning, because if you're focused on keeping multiple plates spinning, then that lowers your awareness of any detail of a particular plate, right? And so again, as a metaphor, if you're spinning a plate to keep it up on its post, you're running around touching each one of these, 10 or 12 plates just to keep them spinning. It's very difficult to notice the pattern on the dish, right? It's very difficult to say, oh, that's the one with the gold trim and the thing, right? And so there's no time to inspect or focus on any particular piece of work because we know we've got to be at the next piece of work. And this plate spinning seems to be the default. If nothing else, it seems that way because the discussion around monk mode makes it this elaborate thing that we have to get into. And I do think that's unfortunate because, as I've said before, it's better if that's kind of the default. But here we are. If you agree with me that monk mode should be the default rather than plate spinning, then I've got good news. That's what this podcast is about. It's about how do we become better as knowledge workers. Tips and conversations like this that help us understand that we've got these opportunities to push back against plate spinning mode. I built Attention Compass in part in order to help us enter into these longer periods of focused work. And so monk mode and Attention Compass go hand in hand. When I'm training people on Attention Compass, I usually refer to it more with work block terminology, but that's something that's built deeply into the Attention Compass work management process, is to get us to periods of time when we can really focus on the work that we need to do rather than being distracted by either, and again, the term distraction, by either external or internal issues, and to deal with those things in fairly specific ways so that they get away, they don't hamper our ability to get into monk mode multiple times per day. So if that's something you're interested in understanding more about, you've taken a good first step because you're here on the podcast, but feel free to reach out or hit me on the website or whatever I can do to help you understand how best to put these work practices into place. In summary, right? So we're thinking about monk mode, and I'll wrap this thing up into a nice package for us so we can remember it better. I love the notion of monk mode, if for no other reason than because it's highlighting one of the things that's really important in order for knowledge workers to be more effective. I argued that there are significant factors working against monk mode, period, and specifically working against monk mode as the default operation. And we talked about our biology, we talked about our culture, and we talked about our organizational things that really fight against that. And I hope that that's motivating for you because you realize that this is not going to happen accidentally. And you realize that you're going to have to put some effort forth in order to be able to get monk mode as your default mode. And also recognize that part of the reason it's a cultural phenomenon is because other people are having this same issue. Other people are in plate spinning mode, whether they look like it or not, they are. And so it's not a problem that's unique to you. It's not some psychological failure or some moral failure or some discipline failure that puts you into plate spinning mode. It's these other factors. It's the culture is plate spinning. And you should take great encouragement from the fact that there are people that are talking about monk mode and talking about how important it is and talking about different ways to get into it and to stay in it. But that also is an indication that it's not a trivial thing to do in the prevailing culture with our biology. So be encouraged to put forth some effort to make this happen in your work. and it's not terribly easy. My clients will tell you that Attention Compass has made it easier for them. I hope this has been helpful to kind of unpack monk mode and see where we are on this thing. I hope you better understand the forces that are going to fight against you as you try to do it, and thus are better prepared to put forth the effort that it's going to require. Feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to talk. We do question and answer. So if this raised a question for you or some detail that you'd like for me to expand on further or inspired you to think about something totally different, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach me on LinkedIn, or you can hit me via email. My email is larry@dobusywrite. So I look forward to hearing from you. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusywrite.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.